My name's Imraan Valodia. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Climate Sustainability and Inequality at Wits. And I want to welcome you all to this Pro Vice Chancellor lecture on climate change. So as part of the work that we're doing at Wits on climate change is we have a series of lectures where we kind of really feature big kind of international names kind of who are doing work on climate change, but also big names from Wits who are doing work on climate change. And we try to combine those and kind of make sure that we have a good spread of international and local speakers. We also have an annual kind of faculty symposium on climate change, and many of us in the room here have been in that symposium for the whole day today. As part of that program, we have a keynote lecture, and this lecture that we're about to hear is therefore kind of achieving both of those objectives. It's both a Pro VC lecture, but also a lecture that's the keynote for kind of for the symposium. And the question that we're going to be grappling with kind of in the lecture today is, what does one do when the real actor who should be answering for something is not there to answer? What does one do in that sort of dilemma? And kind of specifically around we kind of having to deal with that problem specifically around climate change, because the largest contributor to climate change, and that's the US, has decided that it's no longer going to stick to all of the treaties that the world has agreed to, and that it's going to continue to behave with complete abandon, kind of irrespective of its impacts on climate change. And for those of you who followed the US elections, you would have seen the kind of graphic where kind of President Trump at that time said his plan is that the US is going to pump baby pump. And I think we're seeing that strategy and that kind of abandoning of responsibility is really set of questions about what should we do in kind of in that situation. Does that add further responsibility on us to kind of reduce our kind of our climate impact? Or do we say, as a small player in that space, we really can't change things, and therefore we should also start to kind of start to behave in an irresponsible way? I think this kind of question raises a real moral dilemma for us to think about, and we have a real expert to help us to think through what are the things that we should consider when we evaluate that issue, and in tackling that moral dilemma, how should we act? So our most prominent philosopher, who is both a professor at Wits University, but also a professor at the Johns Hopkins University in the US, is about the best person in the entire world, I think, to help us to think through this dilemma, because she has a presence in our community, and I think better than anyone else, kind of understands the issues in the US, because she's also thinking about it kind of at her job, kind of in the US. Kind of Professor Allais has done an extensive amount of work on how one grapples with these sorts of dilemmas. So without me talking for much longer, I'm going to hand it over, kind of over to Professor Allais to help us to think through this issue. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Imraan. It's great to be here. So last year at the Climate Symposium, Imraan invited me to take part in a debate on the question of what should developing countries like South Africa do with their fossil fuel reserves. And this year he's asked me to revisit what is already a pretty complicated question in the light of the new administration in the US. So what should a developing country like South Africa do about our development path, including our use of fossil fuel reserves, if the world's biggest economy, the biggest contributor to cumulative emissions, and the current second largest emitter, the country has increased wealth levels for some to unimaginable levels, is going on a path of doubling down on fossil fuel emissions. So our reductions obviously are a drop in the ocean if the US doesn't meet its goals. So why should we sacrifice if they're doing the opposite? In this new world order or disorder, should we just go ahead and invest more in fossil fuels technologies for the sake of our economy? What responsibilities do we have to reduce our emissions if the US is increasing its emissions? So the US under former President Biden signed historical legislation investing in renewable infrastructure, but also increased oil production. In fact, under Biden, the US became a net exporter of oil, and it also has plentiful and pretty cheap natural gas. And to mention just a few of the things that's happened in the interesting first 6 months of this year, the president has withdrawn from the Paris Accords, withdrawn America's pledged transition funding, including about 1.5 billion to South Africa, undone most of the investment in green infrastructure, repealed tax credits for wind, solar, and electric vehicles, increased logging in national forests, abolishing previously held forest protections, blocking state and is fast-tracking deep-sea mining, blocking state climate laws like California's vehicle emission standards, increasing oil and gas production, giving tax breaks to oil, gas, and coal, opening up more opportunities for drilling on public lands and offshore, deregulating the Environmental Protection Agency, including measures like repealing the stream rule, which protected water from coal mining, and anti-bribery rules for oil and gas companies, cutting jobs and funding at the EPA, pausing electric vehicle adoption, and he's rolled back vehicle emission standards, and the president has even signed an executive order banning paper straws. Okay. It's a complicated assessment, but it's been estimated that his recently passed one big bill is going to result in 575 million tons more greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to what would have been expected without the bill. Okay, so what does this mean for us? In this context, what are our obligations? What should we be doing? And how should we be thinking about our development path? Our fossil fuel reserves are mostly coal, and we still have quite a lot. We derive significant foreign reserves from coal, and we've got about 80,000 direct jobs in coal mining, and of course, more indirect jobs. And burning coal is our main source of electricity. We've got the world's 7th largest coal-powered fleet. So as we know, one thought that people have in South Africa is that we haven't caused the problem, and we've got resources that we could profit from. The developed world has profited from their natural resources and from ours. Isn't it only fair that we get to profit from our natural resources? Isn't it our turn to burn? So as Imraan said, I'm a philosopher. So that means that unlike almost everybody else at the Climate Symposium, I don't do empirical research. But I love attending the symposium and learning about all the exciting work in different areas of things that are happening across the university. What philosophers do is we specialize in carefully unpacking concepts, thinking through assumptions, and asking what sometimes seem to be kind of basic questions like what does the concept of fairness even mean? What moral obligations are based on? And philosophers also specialize in understanding and developing arguments. And I think that's a real contribution to a community like this, because in this area, there are that need to be made repeatedly and in many different places. Okay, so unpacking Imraan's question to me a bit, I think there are different ways to approach it. So you could think about it from the point of view of what is fair or just. Justice is concerned with fairness, but also with issues like historical reparations. But moral obligations aren't only a matter of justice. Sometimes they're things you ought to do, even if it isn't fair that you ought to do them. So we've got still a further question about what are our obligations, and how are our obligations affected if others don't do what's fair or just, or don't meet their obligations. And then we've got a separate question of what's in our interests. So both for individuals and for countries, what we ought morally to do, or the right thing, and what's good for our interests don't always align. Okay, so I want to think about this question from the point of view of those three questions, and then I want to use that to think about what South Africa should do, and also a little bit in closing just about what Wits should do. Okay, so the first question is about what is fair or just. So what is a just way internationally of phasing out fossil fuel extraction? Does fairness entitle us to continue extracting and profiting from our reserves? So everyone knows that Africa is the continent least responsible for cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, that it's the most vulnerable, among the most vulnerable to the effects of climate instability, and has among the least capacity to mitigate the problems and to finance the transition. So as a basic matter of justice, it seems pretty uncontroversial that those more responsible for the problem should pay more. And this seems even more obvious when those more responsible are also more resourced and richer, and where these two facts are linked. So they built their wealth extracting and burning fossil fuels. And this basic idea was agreed to in the 1992 UN Framework Convention of Climate Change, which says that countries should protect the climate on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. It also, I think, seems pretty uncontroversial to say that fairness implies that the world should focus on reducing extraction fastest where doing so will have the least social costs, and should share transition costs fairly according to the ability to bear those costs, including opportunity costs. So that's, I think, sort of a relatively simple principle, but obviously it's politically very difficult getting rich countries to actually meet their obligations, but it's also complex in how it's interpreted. So for example, in the case of extraction, the extent to which economies depend on fossil fuel extraction doesn't always match the extent to which they have the economic capacity to mitigate the transition. And it doesn't always match their historical responsibility. So for example, Canada and Oman have similar per capita GDP, similar financial resources, but oil is a negligible share of Canada's public revenues, more than 70% of Oman's, so the transition is much easier for Canada. So one suggestion that's been made in an interesting paper by Hickel is to calculate what he calls global carbon debts, which can be used to think about, we can use this to think about how much countries that are not in debt can be compensated for transition costs and opportunity costs by those who do owe a debt. So roughly, the idea is, take the amount of greenhouse gas production consistent with limiting global warming to, say, 1.5 degrees. Think of that as the world's carbon burning budget. And then we can think about how much of that budget each country has used. So if we do this, we see that the global north overshot its 1.5 degree fair share by 1986. It surpassed its 2 degree fair share by 1995, and it's already exceeded its cumulative fair share of the 1.5-degree carbon budget by more than 2.5 times, and that's only measuring cumulative emissions from 1960. On the other hand, the Global South is well within its fair share of the 1.5-degree budget. So you could think, well, doesn't this show that we're entitled to burn more? We haven't yet burned our fair share. But I think that fairness can't mean that each country can claim a right to exploit resources to the same extent that developed countries have, because then we would hit the worst levels of climate catastrophe. It's morally incoherent to say that we have an entitlement to a fair share of destroying the planet. The IPCC 2022 report said that it was humanity's final warning to drastically and meaningfully reduce emissions or face climate catastrophe. The IPCC is also clear that we already have enough oil, gas, and coal, either above the ground or under production, to take us past 2 degrees. And we have enough fossil fuels already above ground or under production to meet the world's needs for the energy transition. And we know that every failure to reduce emissions brings worse consequences for everyone, including ourselves. So the reasonable principle that those who caused the problem owe those who didn't does not imply that anyone has an entitlement to make the problem worse. What the Global South has is not an entitlement to make the problem worse, but an entitlement to be helped with transition and mitigation from those more responsible for the problem. And the International Court of Justice has recently, just a couple of weeks ago, issued a landmark opinion saying that all states have obligations to address fossil fuel production and use in response to a case brought to them by some graduate students in Vanuatu. So they ruled that all states have international human rights obligations, including the rights to ensure life, health, and the rights to a clean and safe environment, and that a state's failure to take appropriate action to protect the climate system from greenhouse gas emissions, including through the production and consumption of fossil fuels, the granting of exploration licenses, the provision of fossil fuel subsidies, may constitute an international wrongful act which is attributable to that state. In addition, I've been talking, so a final point in terms of fairness, I've been talking as if we're in the group who didn't cause the problem. Africa, of course, is the continent least responsible for historical and current emissions, but South Africa is not such a small emitter. We are said to be between the world's 11th and 14th biggest greenhouse gas emitter. There are different ways of measuring in different recent years. And our coal-dominated power sector emitted half of our emissions over the last decades. We have emissions per person above the global average, higher than most developing countries. So I think that in terms of justice and fairness, it's pretty clear that wealthy countries have obligations to finance the energy transition and mitigation. But I think it's also clear that this does not mean that developing countries have an entitlement to not reduce emissions. All countries have an obligation to avoid collective catastrophe. And we are neither the poorest nor merely innocent victims of emissions caused by other countries. Okay, but so the wealthy countries have these obligations, but I'm not holding my breath for them to meet any of their obligations. So how are our obligations affected if others are not meeting their obligations? What if other countries, and especially wealthy countries, are not acting fairly and are not meeting their obligations? They definitely aren't. The current US administration is only the most stark example. So how does this affect our obligations? Sometimes your obligations are affected by what other people do. So sometimes the fact that somebody else is not pulling their weight reduces or even removes your obligation to do something. So suppose we agree to help each other move houses, and I don't turn up on the day that you're moving house, you no longer have an obligation to help me. I backed out, you don't have an obligation. But other times our obligations are not affected by other people acting unfairly and shirking their responsibilities. So suppose it's your partner's turn to walk and feed the dog and they don't do it. You've still got an obligation to walk and feed the dog. It's not, you can't just let it go hungry. And if, like me, you live in a flat, if somebody else doesn't walk the dog when it's their turn, and then I don't work the dog because it's not fair that I should have to, then I'm not only wronging the dog, but I'm also resulting in harm to my own environment when the dog's natural urges become unavoidable. But to take a more stark example, imagine your co-parent leaves you and your child and refuses to pay for their share of the child's needs. You should, of course, do what you can to convince them to step up to their responsibilities and to act fairly. But you can't say in the meantime, well, I only have to feed the child every second day. That's what's fair for me to do. It would, not only would you not do that, it would be wrong for you to feed the child every second day. So your co-parent is wrong, they're not meeting their obligations, and it's not fair that you should have to feed the child every day. And you might have to sacrifice to do so, but the child's needs mean that you have an obligation to keep feeding them every day. So while you are trying to get the co-parent to meet their obligations, you still have to keep feeding the child. And we know that the science is clear that reducing emissions is drastically necessary to avoid catastrophe. So last year at the Climate Symposium, Prof. Engelbrecht pointed out that the world is in big trouble if rich nations that are responsible for a big proportion of emissions don't meet their reduction goals. But also that the world is in trouble if all the poorer countries responsible for about 1% of emissions also don't act, because the emissions produced by all those countries add up. Sometimes when somebody else shirks their responsibilities, it makes what you're trying to do futile. And it's not clear that you can have a moral obligation to do something futile. Okay, so suppose we agree together to carry a heavy object that neither of us can carry on our own, and then you stop carrying your part. It's futile for me to continue to try to carry something that it's not possible for me to carry. And I can't be expected to make sacrifices to do something that it's not possible to do something futile. But reducing emissions is not like that. If some nations fail to meet their obligations, the situation will be worse for all of us than it would otherwise have been. But other nations meeting their obligations will still make the overall situation less bad. The difference made by each bit of reductions matters, and it matters to the future for everyone. And in addition, our reducing emissions as fast as possible is not only meeting an obligation to avoid future catastrophe for ourselves, it's also helping other countries who have similar economies and emissions levels to see how to do it, potentially having a bigger impact on the world by choosing a course of leadership. So if the US or other countries act unfairly or don't meet their obligations, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't meet ours. In terms of justice, fairness, and our moral obligations, we should be doing everything we can to reduce emissions as fast as we can, irrespective of what the US is doing. Okay, but so far I've been talking about aspirational, lofty ideas like justice and fairness and moral obligations. You might think, well, it's all very well for philosophers to talk about these abstract things, but the morally right thing to do, but politicians have to worry about practical questions of the economy. The US president presents his policies as putting America first, looking out for America's interests. So aren't we entitled to do the same? Often, morality and self-interest conflict. Happily, in this case, I think they really don't. It is in our interests to minimize climate catastrophe. It's in our interests to have energy independence, abundant, cheap energy, and it's in our interests to create jobs through renewable and developing renewable industry, and it's in our interests to reduce air pollution. So there are, of course, costs to workers and to state revenue of phasing out extraction. And there are costs involved in reskilling and protecting workers and stabilizing the transition. But these are nothing compared to the costs of catastrophic climate instability scenarios. Extreme weather events, not to mention the possibility of a meter sea level rise, collapse of maize crop farming, collapse of the cattle industry, will cause so much more displacement, worker disruption, and human suffering than the costs of supporting workers through phasing out coal extraction. And the more rapid the transition, the harder it'll be to stabilize in terms of jobs. And the longer it's delayed, the more rapid it will inevitably be. So we need to be planning for phasing out coal burning now. we want to minimize the social costs. And it's not just that reducing emissions will make the future less bad. It can also bring lots of good things in the jobs created by renewable industry and the economic growth that could be opened up by abundant, cheap energy. China apparently got 40% of its GDP from renewable industry last year. So not long ago, people in the climate movement were arguing for degrowth. And this was a politically very hard sell, almost everywhere, but less developed countries will find it particularly hard to accept. It doesn't seem fair for us not to have a chance to develop and grow our economy. But technological progress in the capacities and costs of renewable energy sources have really changed this situation, putting renewables on the side of economic growth. And there's both a positive and a negative side to this argument. The costs of renewables are coming down rapidly, and they offer a lot of economic possibilities. And the future prospects of fossil economics are not good. So solar panels keep getting cheaper on a really dramatic curve, as I'm sure everybody's aware of. China is currently overproducing them. The US and Europe are placing tariffs on these, but countries like Pakistan are just snapping them up. Pakistan's an interesting case in a number of respects. In the 2010s, they were struggling with a lack of generation capacity, a little bit familiar to us. They installed coal power projects. This resulted in an enormous increase in electricity prices, but supply was still unreliable. Also not an unfamiliar story to us. Then there was an influx of cheap solar panels from China, and individuals and businesses have been snapping them up. Pakistan has imported close to 30 gigawatts worth of solar panels since 2020, and the pace is still ramping up. So we know that reliable energy is crucial for big businesses, but also for small businesses, a small food outlet that needs to refrigerate meat, a small copy and print shop. So cheap energy can make the difference to small industries, little businesses being able to thrive and survive, and to small entrepreneurialism. And this is one of the things that's happening in Pakistan. In fact, panels are such a good resource that in rural areas, they've started seeing small solar systems incorporated into dowries. There's been an enormous increase in employment opportunities for technicians and engineers with solar-related expertise and skills in Pakistan. Now, you might think Pakistan is a special case in lots of different ways. It's right next to China, so it's easy for it to benefit from this glut of solar panels. And as I've noted, this is kind of off-grid informal capacity, a lot of it. Very different example is Texas. Texas notoriously has a grid not connected to the rest of the US and run on broadly competitive market principles. It's also a pro-fossil fuel state run by a party committed to climate change denial. They've also seen a huge increase in energy demand recently, much more than the rest of the US. This is partly caused by industry connecting to the grid rather than burning gas on site. So the oil and gas industry themselves are electrifying their operations, which is kind of ironic. Texas also wants to attract data centers, and they're currently meeting this increased demand with renewables because it's the cheapest. So they've added 44 gigawatts over the last 4 years, and 90% of that is in renewables. So they've now got 40 gigawatts of wind, 30 of solar, that's 3 times what we've got, 10 of storage. So 80 gigawatts of renewables and storage. How did this happen in Texas? So some states in the US give preference to lower emitting sources. Texas, by law, gives preference only to the lowest cost. And this is what has driven the growth in renewables. It was not driven by a commitment to reducing emissions. They're ideologically committed to climate denial and extraction. In fact, some of the Republican senators who are waking up to what's happening are trying to introduce laws making the rollout of renewables harder to the economic cost of the state, because that's what they're ideologically committed to. Another totally different socio-political example, the UAE. Obviously, rich in fossil fuel reserves, they are investing massively in renewables and huge solar projects. So in contexts as different as Pakistan, Texas, and the UAE, renewables are supporting economic growth through cheap, clean energy. So I've been talking about panels. Not long ago, the cost of batteries made 24-hour generation from variable renewables expensive. But the cost of batteries is now also coming down incredibly dramatically. There's a really interesting recent white paper, it's in the notes there, looking at costing renewables now that with the new price of batteries, and arguing that the reduction in battery costs makes 24-hour generation affordably within the reach in sunny places. So they're costing very carefully 24-hour generation around the world. The paper argues that this is a turning point in the clean energy transition. Around-the-clock solar is no longer just a technical possibility and a distant dream, but an economic reality. It unlocks game-changing opportunities for energy-hungry industries like data centers and manufacturing. It's extremely valuable for emerging economies, where solar-powered industrial and economic zones can emerge in areas far from existing grid infrastructure, and can bring substantial potential savings on grid expansion costs, because storage allows up to 5 times as much solar capacity to be installed behind the same grid connection, maximizing existing assets and deferring costly upgrades. Batteries also have a smaller physical and emissions footprint than ever, and this is rapidly advancing. The physical footprint of batteries has been cut in half in the last year. It's no longer necessary to use nickel and cobalt. Their lifetime cycles have increased. So solar technology has been advancing for some time, but arguably technological advances in the batteries used for energy storage are really just getting going. New chemistries are coming online. So there are cost savings and economic potential in investing in renewables. On the other hand, while depending on coal, our economy has been damaged by unreliable energy supply. Renewable energy is cheap and keeps getting cheaper, but the price of coal generation is going up. Fossil fuels leave us vulnerable to commodity price fluctuations, price shocks, currency fluctuation, and geopolitical crises. Even while having and burning coal, we've been importing diesel, subject to all these factors. Fossil fuel prices drive inflation disproportionately, because when they go up, everything goes up. Renewables don't have these problems because after the initial investment, the fuel is free. The price of coal is going to drop as the world transitions, and that'll be really damaging to us if we remain reliant on it. And further investment in coal is likely to be wasted on stranded assets, as has happened in Pakistan. So Pakistan, as I mentioned, is now struggling with expensive investments in coal production that the state is stuck with paying for, while the population has been transitioning itself to renewables. So tying our economy to fossil fuels will leave us behind. International regulation is increasingly going to price carbon, and it's going to have a premium on low emissions products. So high emissions electricity systems will shut our exports out of markets like Europe, destroying jobs across many sectors. And I already mentioned that the International Court of Justice has ruled that states must tackle fossil fuels and prevent harm to the climate system, and that failing to do this could result in being liable to pay reparations. Countries could be found liable if they fail to address production, consumption, subsidies, and exploration licenses. And this kind of liability risk is not in our interests. And in addition to our interests with respect to the economic costs of energy independence, it is massively in our interest to reduce air pollution. So the costs and harms of fossil fuel extraction and burning are not only to the stability of the world's climate. The externalized costs of fossil fuel production are paid for socially, including with health costs. Some people argue that phasing out fossil fuel burning would pay for itself even without climate benefits, just by costing the externalized health costs of particulate pollution. Particulate pollution causes death, affects hearts, lungs, cognition, children's developments, and research on these harms keeps seeing them as worse than previously thought. Ambient air pollution is a leading cause of global disease burden, especially in low and middle income countries. Thank you. 2021 research from Harvard estimated that 8 million people died from fossil fuel pollution in 2018, and that it was responsible for 1 in 5 deaths worldwide. In Pittsburgh, the year after a coal processing plant shut down, the town had a 42% drop in weekly cardiovascular emissions, followed by a downward trend for the next 3 years. South Africa has 12 coal-fired plants on the Highveld, and we have an air pollution crisis. It affects the poor the most, but it affects all of us. 2 weeks ago, I went to my doctor with a terrible cough that I couldn't shake. She said, "You do not have an infection, it's the air." We have the highest number of deaths in Africa linked to particulate pollution. We've been ranked highest in the world for emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. And a South African court has ruled that Mpumalanga's unsafe level of air pollution is in breach of residents' constitutional rights as a direct result of coal-fired power. So you can now, weather apps now have this depressing information you can get about air quality. So this is some screenshots from my phone on random days last week showing sulfur dioxide above us in Gauteng. Here's a screenshot showing particulate pollution in Allais at 13.5 times WHO guidelines. That's a crisis. Today, that's the sulfur dioxide above us today. And today our particulate is 3 times the WHO guidelines. It's getting worse all night, and it's going to be worse tomorrow. So both in terms of our obligation to avoid the catastrophes of the worst scenario climate change, and in our obligations to South African people in terms of breathable air, we ought to phase out fossil fuel extraction. So the last point I want to say about the context of the US is that the US is harming itself and the world, and that's not a reason for us to do that. Apart from harm to the world, slowing the rollout of renewables, reversing vehicle emission standards, and encouraging fossil fuels will result in more air pollution for US citizens. It has the danger of making US industries increasingly globally uncompetitive. Their auto manufacturing industry will become less desirable as the world puts a premium on EVs. The US is way behind China on electric cars and solar panels. The Biden infrastructure bill had support for these industries, gave them some chance to be competitive, but this has just been eliminated. So the new policies cement the US being behind China, very likely causing damage to US industry. Most of the world doesn't have its own oil, so it's got an interest in the energy independence that renewables offer. Drilling is getting more expensive, while decreased demand is likely to make the oil price fall, making it harder and harder to make a profit out of the industry they're committing to. So I mentioned the increase in emissions that's estimated to result from the one big bill, but it's also estimated to result in energy costs, increased energy costs for US citizens. So just like making things worse for their citizens. One of the things that's been central to US global dominance is the strength of its university system, which the current administration seems to be aiming to seriously weaken, with massive cuts to research funding. So JHU, the institution I work for, has already lost $1.4 billion, and that's without the cuts to NIH funding that they're talking about. And the administration's hostility to universities and science is at least partly based on their denial of climate science, which of course most serious universities produce. So, of course, the US has always been notorious for not being part of international agreements. But combining this with a loss of soft power, lots of trust from breaching trade deals, abandonment of pledged finance, weakened universities, loss of immigration, harms to industry, and a world increasingly looking to diversify its reserve currencies may mean serious loss of global power in the years to come. And it's putting itself on the wrong side of history in relation to the international community, as in relation to the ICJ ruling on the country's responsibility for emissions. I can't see any reason for us to join it on this path. And finally, what the US does is considerably less important for the world than what China does. So in a recent talk in China, the economic historian, Adam Tooze, showed this amazing slide of world coal production. And he used it to describe the world history in 3 phases. So he says the history of our species on the planet falls into 3 phases. The phase up to 1750, when human societies were burning firewood, human power and animal power. The period between 1750 and the end of the 20th century, classic industrial regime, British, copied by the Germans, the Americans, the Japanese, the Soviet Union, and China in the phase of its development in the 50s and 60s. The third phase, he says, of the history of global economic development starts within all of our lifetimes on the dot of 2000, and that's that last explosive curve of Chinese coal production. Okay, so China's electricity production is twice that of the US. So what every country does matters. Every bit of emissions reductions matters. They all add up, but the future really depends on what China does. Trues also showed this really interesting chart of the world's electricity expansion. So in 2023, China added twice as much fossil fuel production as the rest of the world together. And they added close to twice as much solar and wind as the rest of the world together, and much, much more solar and wind than they did fossil fuels. So in 2023, nearly 5 times as much solar and wind as fossil fuel expansion. And that bottom chart, you can see on the left, there's the fossil fuel expansion, and then wind, and then solar. That's how much China added in 2024. That's gigawatts of fossil fuel, wind, and solar. So China is expanding renewables with incredible speed, focus, industrial policy, research support, and planning. Most countries don't have oil, but with Chinese technology, they now have energy independence within reach. And that is changing the world rapidly. Okay, so in that context, what should South Africa do? So in terms of our obligations and in terms of our interests, it's completely clear that we need to rapidly reduce emissions as fast as possible while focusing on the human costs, including managing the decline in coal production. So we need to focus on where we have the most emissions and how we can reduce them fastest. And that means rapidly reducing our dependence on burning coal for electricity and replacing it with renewables and storage. That is the most urgent thing we need to do and should be doing. The next biggest sources of emissions is transport and industry, so we should also be focusing on that. So in terms of electricity generation, I'm not the empirical scientist, as lots of you are, but here are some possibilities. Buying as much as possible of the Chinese solar panel glut. Given grid constraints, looking into distributed solar wherever possible, investigating mini grids for local generation, encouraging rooftop solar, and given the enormous advances in battery prices and technology, storage also offers really good opportunities for reducing pressure on the grid, and that's also something we should be investigating. We also need to use the transition as potential industrial development and jobs creation. Investing in clean, reliable energy can help us achieve energy independence, stop harming health, support small and big businesses, as well as having the potential to create direct jobs. So the grid build we need is relatively labor intensive, which includes a significant number of jobs. Beyond South Africa, the Southern African region has many minerals needed for the transition. If we can develop and build processing and manufacturing capacity in these minerals, that can create economic growth and jobs compensating for loss of coal jobs. We're currently importing batteries while having reserves of manganese, platinum, and other rare earth materials that are the critical ingredients for manufacturing clean energy storage systems and storage, so we should be investing in local production. In relation to developing generation through renewables, how much of a priority should green hydrogen be, I think is a complicated question. That is something we're investing in South Africa and also at Wits. But the use of green hydrogen is still relatively speculative, and it's still pretty expensive. It involves some pretty serious technical challenges, including in relation to transport and leaking, and we're not the only ones attempting to invest in it, and we're already behind Namibia. So it looks like a good thing to invest in. It looks like it is going to be an area of technological innovation. It could play a big role in fertilizer. But it's not a solution for the rapid reduction of emissions that we need right now, unlike solar, wind, and storage. So I don't think it should be prioritized above replacing coal generation with renewables. People also talk about something called clean coal, people at Wits included. This term can apply to a variety of things that are used to make coal plants more efficient. And obviously, it's a good thing to make the use of coal more efficient. It often refers to carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture and storage is currently really expensive, both to build new infrastructure and to retrofit old plants. And that's why Eskom isn't doing it. On the contrary, our trend has been relaxing standards against international norms. So economic use of this technology is only a future possibility. It can't be a reason for continuing fossil fuel extraction when there are alternatives. And whatever carbon capture and storage technology becomes scaled up economically is going to be needed to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, no matter how fast we reduce emissions. So it can't be seen as a license for burning carbon that we could avoid burning. And coal, of course, produces other pollutants like mercury and nitrogen oxide. So fossil fuels are necessary for the production of renewable infrastructure. That might change as long as it lasts. They're going to have a role. But we should not be burning them for our electricity supply. Hydrogen, so-called clean coal, carbon capture and storage are very likely going to play a role. If we ever get to net zero, they'll play an essential role. But the first large chunk of emissions reductions can be achieved much faster and cheaper using solar, wind, and storage, and that should be an immediate priority. And our next biggest source of emissions is transport, so we should be looking at urban planning, public transport, and EVs. We need to manage the transition costs, of course, in coal-producing areas. Whoops. And mines have funds for post-mining rehabilitation. There's potential for rehabilitation of land uses like agriculture with transitional agriculture like hemp farming. That could create jobs, but that requires planning and attention. The mining, rehabilitation, hemp farming, phasing into agriculture has the potential for a couple of decades of job creation. And we should also look, in terms of managing the transition, into building renewables in Mpumalanga near current power stations. So the Northern and Western Cape has got the best sun and wind, and the most open land, but Mpumalanga's got pretty good sun, better than most of Europe that's using solar. And generation there could make use of the existing grid more easily, replacing some of the direct and indirect jobs in the coal industry. In terms of what South Africa can do, I just want to make a little plea for protecting wild nature or non-human nature, which is a different issue from reducing emissions. The problems posed by human and other life by rapidly changing the world's climate are related to another planet-wide problem, which is habitat loss and degradation. The problems are to some degree separable. Loss of ecologies and resulting loss of species is its own problem. Habitat protection is a separate priority, which I think is also important in South Africa. There might be future technology like carbon capture that mitigates emissions, but there's no technological fix for a species that's gone. Africa is the last continent to have significant charismatic megafauna and significant wilderness. We have significant wilderness. And wild nature or non-human nature has its own value. We should be aiming to protect our ecosystems, biodiversity, and species, and to reverse losses, setting aside land for non-human wild nature in conjunction with communities. If this is well planned, it has the potential to create jobs. The Great Barrier Reef in Australia very nearly was destroyed by mining. A small conservation group stopped that mining, and it's now completely uncontroversial in Australia that its economic value is much greater untouched than what they would have got from that bit of mining. Australia has recently pledged no new extinctions and 30% land under protection. And protecting wild nature is not a case in which our action is undermined by other countries not acting. Every bit of ecosystem that's preserved is preserved. Of course, agriculture is another big issue that intersects with habitat loss, so we need to work out how to develop food production systems that involve less habitat destruction. The plastic crisis is another crisis, but I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to, for the last couple of minutes, transition from the question of what South Africa should do to just very quickly look at the question of what should we do? What should Wits do? So we are told that Wits gives you the edge and that Wits is for good. So how can Wits play a leadership role in enabling South Africa to do the things I've been discussing? Well, one of the important things Wits has done is create and now extend, happily, a Pro-VC for climate inequality and sustainability. That was a really important move. And it's great that we're doing all this research across the university and that Imraan and his office have done so much work in having these regular talks as well as this wonderful event. But I think it's now time for Wits to take this to the next level. We need to ask if we are currently treating the climate emergency as an emergency and facing it strategically and ambitiously. And I think we need to ask this both in terms of our research and our own environmental footprint. So in terms of research, bringing together and focusing and sharing existing research, which is what this wonderful forum does, is super important. And it's been a great thing to do. But I think that really taking the situation seriously and treating it as an emergency involves strategic planning and intervention. So it's a feature of academics that we work on things we're interested in, which is great. That's why we became academics. But it doesn't necessarily coincide with the most targeted interventions necessary to rapidly meet an emergency. So in addition to bringing the community together and learning about what people are working on, we should be asking, what do we need the university to work on to rapidly meet South Africa's goals? So Imraan mentioned this morning, which is really great, the idea of developing the next step of developing a vision for research across the university. So that I think that's really crucial. We need to work out what we need to work on. We need to identify key areas that will have the biggest impact on rapid reduction, that should be, of emissions and a just transition, and create posts and direct research in these areas. So how quickly did the university create the Mind Institute? It was decided that AI was a strategic priority for the African continent. We created a center, including funding jobs. We haven't done that in the same way for the climate emergency. I asked in Senate about the Mind Institute, where is the funding for these jobs coming from? And people said to me, it doesn't matter, we're going to address that. This is too important for us not to do it. The same thing applies to the climate emergency. This is too important for us not to do it. And I'm not saying we need another center or institute. We have the GCI. I'm saying we need to work out the areas in which research can make the most rapid impact on reducing emissions and fund posts in those areas. So some possible areas of focus: can South Africa and Wits use our mining expertise and infrastructure to explore and drive geothermal energy? There's been incredibly interesting progress in geothermal in other countries. We don't seem to be doing any of it. Mining engineering capacity is key to geothermal, and the skills of fossil fuel infrastructure can be transferable to geothermal. We could also do more resource mapping on the minerals key to the transition, and focusing research on how to make mining less environmentally destruction. So this town and this university were built on mining. South Africa has minerals needed for the transition, and the region has more. We should be focusing on developing how to do mining with as little harm as possible. One could take our history and our entanglement with mining as a negative, but we could also make it a virtue. Mines care about their futures. We should be partnering with them to harness this potential. There's also enormous potential in electrochemical research in relation to batteries, but also hard to abate industries. We should be identifying that. So engineering and mining are two areas of the university that it seems to me have been slightly less present in this forum and also in the talks that we have across the year. I think we should focus on posts and support and bringing these areas into more focus in working out how Wits can lead South Africa's transition. But in addition to technological research, the transition requires policy. Solar can be extremely cheap, but the wrong market structure can result in there being no economic incentive to invest it, to develop it, to the cost of the overall economy, as well as the climate and human health. I mentioned how Pakistan is now people are getting cheap and clean energy, but the government is stuck with financing big coal investments for which there's no longer demand, leading to a utility death spiral as stranded assets get more and more expensive, which could be really disastrous. We're already seeing some of this in South Africa as the businesses and consumers who can afford switch to solar, and the government is stuck with funding fossil fuel investments and passing higher electricities onto those who can't pay, resulting in social instability. We're already seeing this. This is an area in which we need focused research on the policy and regulatory environment that can best deal with these problems. I mentioned at the beginning that the US has withdrawn 1.5 billion transitional funding that it pledged to us, but others have pledged more, and much of what we lost from the US was commercial debt, which somebody in the Presidential Commission told me was not a major loss. But anyway, the total pledged funding, the same person also told me, is probably a tenth of what we need for the transition. And the rest will need to come from private investment, keeping grants for unfundable justice priorities. So we need a policy environment that makes us an attractive place for this investment. And that's something Wits should be doing research in. There are lots of issues with respect to getting the policy and regulatory environment right to incentivize renewables, create jobs, as we heard from Kate and Preacher this morning, making the jobs actually make sense on place in the ground. And that should be a research focus at Wits. This could include modeling social policy to help understanding the disruption of labor markets and the income support required to cope in phasing out coal. And I'll just now, name him since he is actually here. But Chippy Oliver from the Presidential Climate Commission said that would be of interest to Treasury. So that's research Wits should be doing. And then just very briefly, as the last point, Wits's own carbon footprint. So some of us have asked every year in this forum, as well as in Senate, about the university's carbon footprint. And Senate does have a report on this. Some progress is being made. It seems to me unambitious. And the attitude that I feel I've heard from infrastructure people at Wits, both at Senate and in this forum, seems to me unambitious and negative, focused on problems, why it's difficult, not on leading in coming up with solutions. So people have said at previous meetings here, well, solar panels can't be recycled, and actually they have costs. And while we sit here pointing out problems and complications, other people in the world have developed ways of recycling. Why aren't we doing that? Why don't we identify problems and then lead research in solving them, rather than presenting the problems as a reason not to do stuff? 3 years ago, some of us asked why we couldn't have solar panels on our parking lots like UJ has had since 2020. We were told that Wits doesn't have enough parking lots to actually provide a significant amount of solar power. But why is that a reason not to have solar panels on the parking lots that we have? We don't seem to have any 5 years after UJ covered its parking with solar panels. We could combine this with research projects in recycling solar panels. So there is some solar being rolled out, but I don't see an ambitious plan, and neither do I see a plan that has milestones oriented towards net zero, which I think is what's needed. We asked for an energy audit. There is some progress being made on that. We've been told that progress towards understanding the baseline information will have been made by the end of 2025. I still work in an office that is so overheated because the heating is set centrally and I can't turn it down, that I have to open my windows in winter to make my office a bearable temperature. So it doesn't seem to me that we're acting as if there's an emergency that requires everyone to reduce their carbon emissions as quickly as possible. So here's a pledge we made in Senate, I think in 2023. We committed to playing a transformative leadership role using our location and the economic hub of the country and our history in mining and industry to play a pivotal role in a just and equitable transition to a net zero economy. transforming the university into a living laboratory for just practices of sustainability. I think we've made really good progress to doing that. I really welcome Imraan saying this morning that there's now going to be attention to the vision for the future, because I think we now need to step up and make this a reality. That's all.
So I was kind of clearly aware that that when I asked Lucy to do this talk, that she was going to throw a few bombs towards me. So thank you for that, Lucy. I think we have some time for kind of questions and some time for an engagement. One of the things I learned at the seminar, at the kind of symposium today, is that if you do something hybrid, that actually the people who are not in the room are at a significant disadvantage. So to fix that, I think we need to take the first round of questions from those who are online, and I'm going to ask Cash to help me with who those are. So those online, you have the first opportunity to ask questions, and we'll take 3 questions. Okay. Okay, so let me then open it up in the meantime for any questions kind of inside the room. Are you okay with 3? All right, so we have one there. Anyone else? Crispin and Sally. So let's take that as the first round.
Good afternoon, Prof. My name is Tembelani Mazibubo. I work for an NGO. My question, I don't think I heard you mention nuclear energy. What do you think of that? Because it seems to me that it doesn't have a lot of the negative environmental effects, like air pollution. I know it's got some bad PR, but it doesn't have the negative that coal and fossil have. While it may not be clean, it doesn't have the negative effects. So what do you think of nuclear energy?
Let's move to Crispin. Just move out there.
Thanks for a really passionate and well-made argument. There's little I have to quibble, but maybe two points. The first is you make a case for proactive management of the social consequences of the economic disruption in this transition. And I think we would all agree with that. What you don't mention is that we have a weak elite captured state that is in many ways incapable of managing those social consequences. So, for instance, we're not seeing the kinds of proactive investment in social safety nets or skills development or even a credible economic diversification strategy. So does that change your argument? Do we, continue without being able to mitigate those social consequences? The second question, you made a statement, which is we must reduce emissions as fast as possible. And I want to check that that's what you really meant. Because there are some, we've got a very strong climate justice movement, which says, get out of coal immediately, tomorrow. Which would have quite alarming social consequences, not least for the levels of employment. We as a country have committed to get to net zero by mid-century, by 2050, which implies a managed pace of transition. And the real debate seems to be about what that pace should be. Not as fast as possible, but managed in a way that exit in a socially responsible way while we build out other economic sectors. So I just want you to comment on that question of pace.
Over to Sally.
Thank you. I hope you can remember all these questions, Lucy. It was great to see the paper by Jason Hickel. But when I read that paper, what struck me is that he identifies South Africa as a country is already in climate debt. So we are in equivalent climate debt to many of the global north countries. But unfortunately, we've burned through all of this fossil fuels without actually uplifting the majority of the people here. So then do we still have a claim for the support of the more developed and wealthy countries? And how should we stake that claim, if so, and how should we argue for it? I mean, at the end, you were saying a very small proportion of our needs, our financial needs for transitioning can be provided by outside governments, and we need to generate it internally. But I do think it would be interesting to know how much we can ask the rest of the world to assist us, considering we are also in climate debt.
Amazing questions. So the first question about nuclear. So there is very interesting technological development being done on nuclear. I haven't followed very recently, but I know that there was some recently interesting talk about modular development of nuclear. The problem with nuclear is that it's expensive and slow. So I think what role it could have, I'm not opposed to it. I'm not opposed to the possible development of it. I kind of wouldn't want, moving ahead to Crispin's question about the weak state, the people who can't manage wet coal to be managing a nuclear facility. So, you know, there are some concerns there because it does require, you know, good management. But I think it could definitely have potential, but it's slow and expensive to build, whereas renewables are becoming really cheap. So that to me speaks for prioritizing renewables when we have so much sun and wind, like the best in the world. Crispin asked two really difficult questions. One about, should we continue with the transition if the state is too weak to do mitigation? Well, so in a way, I was addressing the question of what should we do? So I'm trying to answer the argument of the people who say it's our turn to burn. There's a separate question about how we can actually make that happen. And that's really complicated. It's politically complicated, it's economically complicated, and it involves policy and stuff. And that's, I mean, so when I was saying that Wits needs to be doing research in the policy and regulatory frameworks that not the just sort of ideals, but what will actually work on the ground? What kind of incentives do municipalities need? You know, so given lack of capacity. So I think we need to be trying to understand how we can do this, as well as I think that we should be doing it. But also I think that the weakness of the state is not a reason to not be transitioning, because it's also a problem for, you know, the lack of social support is not, it's not only a problem for the transition, it's also a problem, you know, for the people who are currently struggling with respiratory disease in Mpumalanga, and the people whose electricity prices are going to be getting higher every year as those who can afford transition. So, you know, I think the weakness of the state cuts in all directions. And I think it's not a reason for us not to be embracing this transition. On the other hand, in relation to your second question, as fast as possible, given what? As fast as possible while managing the social costs in a reasonable way. I think, how fast is that? I think that's something that could change quite rapidly. You know, if maybe renewable generation in Mpumalanga could create a significant number of jobs. So how fast can we manage the social effects while transitioning? I think that's not a stationary target, and that's something we can change by trying to transition faster while focusing on the social costs. But I agree with you. We should be. We can't do it without focusing on the social transition. So as fast as possible, given mitigating the social costs of the transition. So I agree with your qualification there entirely. Sally's question, yeah, I was trying to say we aren't innocent victims of emissions by other countries. On the other hand, we're dramatically less responsible than the biggest emitters. So do we have a justice claim? You know, in a way, I think the developed world kind of owes the rest of the world, but I think in a way it's a kind of irrelevant question because they're not going to pay. I mean, they also owe the rest of the world for colonialism. Like, has anybody ever, like, it's not going to happen. So, you know, you said that I said that only a small amount can be provided. I mean, it's not that only a small amount can be provided. Only a small amount is going to be provided. So what they've pledged to us, they've made pledges to us. It's a tenth of what we need. And more isn't going to be forthcoming. So we need to just step up and act. And, you know, as, our DVC for Research said at a recent Wits event, part of what's happened with the US cutting off a whole lot of funding and research in a lot of areas has meant we've had to like not just rely on one source and step up and stand on our own feet and, you know, work out how we're going to manage these things. And I think that's the only option we have actually in this situation, because, you know, waiting for the developed world to pay all its historical debts, well, you know, I'm not holding my breath. So whether or not we have a claim, I think is kind of not really relevant. But we could become on the hook for actually owing if we keep emitting at the rate at which we are, according to the ICJ ruling.
Right. So I think we have two questions online. I'm going to ask the speakers who type them out to just kind of ask their questions. Am I right that you can that you can allow those online to speak? Okay, so let's go to Mary and then to Jesse online, and then we'll come back to the room. Kind of over to you.
I think she's written it out,
okay.
So we could just read it.
All right. You want to just have a go?
So can everybody read what Mary said, or should I read it out? So Mary says, we know that it's difficult to change positions in the country, but we should act at Wits. How should this be done? I'm not sure it can be done by Senate. So Imraan said at the beginning of the question period that I was having a go at him, but that actually wasn't what I was doing, because actually I think Imraan has created the foundations for Wits to take the next step. And Imraan said this morning that the part of the next step is developing the university's vision for its future work across the university on this topic. So I think that this community that has been brought together now, is this the third or fourth? Fourth, for 4 years, this community has a lot of insight. We should be working with the GCI, and we should be, I don't really know what the exact official forum would be, but bring together the people with expertise across the university to think about what are the areas where Wits's research could contribute in the most rapid way to South Africa's reducing emissions. What are the areas of research where Wits's research could most contribute to Johannesburg and Gauteng's reduction in emissions? And then we should be looking to fund that, like we did with the Mind Institute. And I do think that working with the mines should be a really important possibility. So I think we really need to bring, so there of course has always been some engineering and mining in this forum, but I think we really could bring that in more and work with those faculties more, and have like more of the talks across the year that this that Imraan's office runs, bring in overseas people from mining and engineering and sort of the harder to in a way bring in faculties, and that I think there's a lot of potential for research there. So I think we need to get, so Imraan was saying that we want to develop the vision, and I think the vision should be strategically focused on what Wits can do to most rapidly reduce emissions and mitigate the social costs of the transition.
So just on that, can I just say one quick thing? Victor, who's there, sent me a WhatsApp this morning when we started, saying, isn't it fantastic that at the symposium this year we have as many new faces as we do, and two, that we have to bring in extra chairs to make sure that there was seating for everyone. And my response to him was, that's fantastic. That's fantastic, because what we're doing is to build a movement. And I think that's how we get change, to kind of counterable the pressure. So the second question is from Jesse, and it's about your point about South Africa being a high emitter. She's asking the question about, is that the case if we take it on a per capita basis?
So it wasn't. So the claim wasn't that we're the that our per person is particularly high in the world. It was that it's the highest in the developing world. The claim that it has the 11th highest emission in the world. So I did put my source on the slides, and I think the slides will be distributed. So, you know, I didn't myself do the research that came up with that claim, but I did find sources for it. So, so it seems a lot, but we can look at the sources. Yeah, I agree. We have run. So the other question is that we have successfully run nuclear before. So I'm not opposed to nuclear. I think we can successfully run nuclear. I just think that it's slow and expensive, and solar is currently becoming cheaper and cheaper, and is much more modular.
Great. So let's take one more round in the room. I had Matthew and Dinga, and then let's go here. There'll be time for one more round.
Thanks, Lucy, again for great talk. One qualm I had is, I think with the Wits side, you shortchanged the social sciences by focusing on policy, and that's it. But it's not about policy. South Africa is full of great policies, and in fact, we have often the implementation of the policies and their social effects, or where things fail. And I think we're missing actually the huge role of social sciences actually is training people who can actually be in communities, who can observe those effects, who can mitigate. And that's an essential role. And it's also relatively AI-proof role, because we're not going to replace those types of work. And yet, Wits has very little support for that type of, or generally that type of training that allows people directly to go into those spaces of jobs. So I think there needs to be really also commitment in the social sciences for that kind of project. Linked to that, I mean, I totally take the kind of pragmatic and urgent view, and that we have to use market-based mechanisms and so on, or state whatever we need. But that doesn't take away, you know, I accept like Hickle's approach of degrowth, or is limited in this context. It doesn't take away, I think, a necessity actually for kind of experimentations in new social forms that are between the market and not reliant on kind of state dependency, forms of collectivization, socialization of infrastructure and so on. And I think that has to remain part of the project.
All right, I'll be quick. My name is Dinga Sikwebu. Now that is after hours. I'm a retired trade unionist. I just have a small question. Again, thank you for the presentation. I think what we had today is something that needs a broader amplification, because the narrative that we didn't cause this, why are we being dragged into it, is quite widespread in the union movement and in social movement. And I think in the Twitterati is also quite big on this. My question is about, given what you said must be done at a global, at the sort of the common level, although we understand the differentiated part, what platforms and at a global level will be able to ensure that the rapid implementation of what you're suggesting takes place? I'm asking this because there are frustrations about the United Nations processes and the UNFCCC. And with Trump pulling out, what do you see as the possible platforms to ensure this rapidity? I know that that was not your brief, but I'm interested to hear what you think about that.
Trade union trick. Saying you're going to be short and long.
Prof, just a couple of things. You mentioned the net zero strategy without a formal definition. Incidentally, the 2050 or the net zero strategy coincides globally with a 2050 deadline. And so I failed to see the link you made, or I might just have been slow in grasping it, but how you made the connection between a net zero strategy and a direct correlation to renewables with battery storage.
Over to you, Lucy.
There's one thing I want to say to all three of these questions. It was about, I didn't talk about the social sciences, I didn't define net zero, I didn't talk about platforms, that I talked for 10 minutes longer than I was asked to talk for. And I think I talked quite fast and, you know, can't say everything in one talk. So Matthew, of course I agree, social sciences and humanities, you know, literature and other fields, completely important for this area. In a way, part of the reason that I was focusing on mining engineering is because social sciences are already bringing themselves into these spaces. That doesn't mean that they don't need support and funding from the university. So I was throwing out a couple of areas where I think the university has a lot of potential that hasn't really, as far as I can see, being worked on, like in the geothermal. That seems to me that we should be investigating. That's not to say that that was meant to be like an exclusive list of the things that we should be investing in. I totally think the social sciences and what, you know, America distinguishes between the social sciences and the humanities. We have them both in one thing, but both of those, I think, have really, really important contributions. In terms of, you know, so I'm not talking about, you know, I don't like to say market-based or not market-based. I think it's about the structure of how you structure markets, how you create them. They're not natural things that exist on their own without being structured, and they aren't, you know, just like natural market forces that exist on their own. So it's a question of what you want to do with them and where you want to use them. So I think that's a question. Can we experiment with, you know, other ways of living? You know, I'm trying to here give sort of a relatively pragmatic argument in a, you know, that politicians or, you know, business could have some interest in. And yes, I think, of course, we should be doing those other things as well. But, you know, you can't argue for everything at once. The possible platforms for rapid implementation. So I'm just sort of in this talk thinking about just stuff that South Africa should be doing for itself, rather than thinking about international platforms. Like, how can we as a country step up? And that's obviously complicated if there's a weak state, but we can still talk about stuff the state does, you know, has some capacity. We can talk about stuff the state can do, but we can also talk about stuff that we can do research in, what we can do where the state is weak. So going back to Matthew's question, you said we have good policy. Well, we have good aspirations, but that's not quite the same as policy that works out what will actually incentivize a local municipality to do something. So when I'm talking about the policy and regulatory framework, that's also what I'm talking about, not sort of aspirational statements of what we want, but like trying to understand what will actually make something work on the ground. That's where I think we should be doing research. No, I didn't define net zero, and I'm definitely not going to try to. I'm not sure if I entirely understood the question about why there's a link between renewables and. I'm not. I think I just didn't understand the question. So,
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to indulge us a bit and take one more round of questions, so we go a bit beyond the 6 o'clock cutoff. But there were some hands that were up in the past that I kind of really need to go to. So I'm going to ask you all to please kind of hold off raising hands. This woman had her hand up. I'll come to you and then we'll take it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. My name's Samiksha Singh. I'm from the GCRO. Maybe you can comment on this, but I was just wondering, you've presented something that seems achievable and doable, especially with the costs of solar coming down, as well as the health benefits to people with cleaner energy. But why are countries hesitant to do this? Has it something to do with who benefits financially from coal mining and burning of fossil fuels, as well as like wars and controlling oil, those kind of things? Just some comment around that.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you so much for your presentation as well. It was quite eye-opening and I really enjoyed it. I was just going back to the G20 climate change meeting that took place in Manaus in Brazil, in December last year. I think it was President Biden's last international visit. All the countries actually pledged amongst the G20 to actually fulfill certain mandates with regard to climate change reduction. But then when we look at South Africa's contribution, it's been a bit disappointing. And talk is cheap, but actions are forceful. So you did recommend things like recycling, geothermal, resource mapping, so that we could be able to reach net zero emissions as a target. And I was just thinking about, there was a Luanda Diamond Commission, it was like a summit of Africa's most powerful diamond producing countries. It took place in Luanda and Angola, and they were with De Beers as well. And they were looking at how they can actually be able to reduce their carbon emissions, especially in the extraction of diamonds and other related minerals. And I was thinking, how can we, like in this room here, what can we do to incentivize the reduction of carbon emissions? Would it be appropriate for us to introduce a mining levy for coal producing and other mining companies? Should there be a mining levy that should be introduced? I think it's long overdue. People talk of a wealth tax. I'm thinking of a mining levy, so that these big corporate companies like Anglo American, they can take responsibility and accountability for the way that they are involved in the increase of carbon emissions. And then I also thought of how we can also incentivize green technology over coal. Can we incentivize tax rebates, tax incentives for companies that prioritize green technology over coal? Can we engage with the South African Revenue Service to promote that? And okay.
Really short time. I don't want to. So let's go to the last one.
Wow, thanks, Gina. Wonderful colleague you are. Thank you. Yes, Desi, thank you very much for the inspirational talk. And I just want to point out, you've mentioned GCI several times, and thank you very much for that. But I do want to mention to all our colleagues here today that the GCI's focus in a climate change research context is very much on adaptation, projecting futures, understanding risks, working in communities towards the uptake of early warning systems and so forth. Our work goes more broadly into sustainability transformations, but once again in the context of adaptation, biodiversity conservation, African food systems, and so forth. But what we are not doing is research on green energy technologies. And I think you are absolutely correct in pointing that out as a major gap at our university, but I think for South Africa as a whole, we should be embracing research on these technologies and be a leader in this field. So our Pro Vice Chancellor, I think, do need to think on our behalf about the real possibility of another center or in some mechanism of focusing research at Wits in this field.
Thanks for all of those questions. Great questions. So the first was a complicated geopolitical question about why countries are hesitant to do this. And so, one could talk about that for a week, but very briefly, I mean, obviously there are entrenched interests. So we have people with entrenched interests in coal production, and obviously the US does. So all countries do. And then also we have the complications of the transition in terms of jobs. But then also one of the issues about renewables, which is, I assume, why Wits is as slow as it is that the overhead investment is expensive. So the initial investment is expensive. But then from then onwards, the fuel is free, whereas Eskom's going to keep getting more expensive. So it's a slightly painful, immediate thing to do for much pain reduction moving forward. The second question was talking about, mining, the possibility of mining levies. So mines already do have financial obligations to contribute to the communities where they're mining. It's an interesting question whether more can be, whether that can be used more. I mean, I think certainly in terms of rehabilitation and transition of mines, that those funds can be used for that. Whether there could be more levies, I think that's a question for somebody in a different discipline than me. But finally, on Francois's point, so I myself don't think that the answer is always a center. I actually think that sometimes people in different disciplines, working in disciplines and teaching in the university, coming together where posts are targeted in strategic areas can be as good. And that's why, so I'm happy that we've got both the Pro Vice Chancellor and the DVC research here. So as you said, Francois, they need to do some thinking for us. So working out the strategic areas where we can invest posts in making Wits a leader in renewable energy production, which we currently aren't doing. But it's not obvious to me that that means creating another center. It could be that it's a post in mining and a post in electrical engineering, electrochemical engineering, and a post in policy, and that these people work in collaboration with Imraan's office, in collaboration with the GCI, so that there is a coordinated vision across the university. But I don't think it always has to be another center. But completely agree with you about the priority.
Right. So I think one of the fantastic things about being being here at Wits is that this is, I think, one of the kind of spaces where strong kind of debate, disagreement, engagement is really is part of the core of the kind of the culture of the university. And I think Lucy is the person sort of par excellence that sort of captures that. So thank you so much for the talk today. Can I ask you to all join me in just thanking you? So there's a whole number of people who've been involved in making the Pro VC seminars possible. There's members of staff of the team that work in the Pro VC's office. There's the kind of events team at Wits that manage all of the logistics. And I think often these people are in the background and not kind of given sufficient credit. So I want to ask you to join me in thanking them for making the effort. Before closing, I want to just share kind of information about two events that might be of interest to everyone here. So on Friday, there's a kind of a book launch of a new book by the head of the African Climate Foundation. Salim Fakir has a new book out that I think grapples with some of these issues around how Africa should be managing this transition and how we think about these development problems kind of across Africa. And it's drawing a large amount from the work that he's trying to do in the foundation. Crispin and I will be speaking there, so kind of look out for that. On September 25th, there's a kind of interesting dialogue at Wits that tackles a problem similar to the one that Lucy has tackled, but slightly opposite. So the problem here has been, what do you do when someone who should be acting isn't acting? I think one of the things that we're not debating enough is the role of China in this transition. And the problem that we're dealing with in that seminar is, what does one do when someone who should be acting has acted so fast and at such scale that it kind of reduces the space for others to act? So this is a seminar that we're doing with UNU wider, and it's kind of on kind of issues of green industrialization, and we have a specialist on kind of how China's dealing with industrialization, the scale of its investments, and what that means for other developing countries. And the debate really is, has China's actions been so strong and so powerful that possibilities for industrialization through a transition are closed off by the extent of China's action? So look out for that one as well. So let me again then thank Lucy for a fantastic evening. We have some drinks outside, so for those of you who are unable to answer your question, kind of apologies from my side, but at least I can supply you with some drinks, and you can ask Lucy your question then. So please join us for something.